Thank you very much. And where did Terry go? Oh, there he is. I just wanted to thank him for the opportunity for the audience tonight, frankly. I've been working on this project now for 3 or 4 months with no one to talk to but my wife about it, and I think she's sick of it, so it's nice to have somebody else. And I can't resist, I didn't realize that the next talk was on April 14th. You picked a very auspicious day. It's one of the, as a historian, I love days that have double headers. April 14th is both the anniversary of the shooting of Abraham Lincoln and the sinking of the Titanic hitting the iceberg. And then it's a great night for a party. They both start on the night of the 14th and finish on the morning of the 15th, so you can go wild. As Terry mentioned, this is for me in one sense, a new project. I've been interested in the history of Montgomery County since I moved here the first time in, I guess, 1981. And particularly since I came back in the mid-'80s and have been here continuously, because I ride a bicycle all over the county. And I've gotten really interested in sort of what I'm seeing as I bicycle around. But in particular, a number of years ago, the university began trying to work more closely with the Alumni Association of the Christiansburg Institute. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Institute, it was an African-American school founded outside Christiansburg at the end of the American Civil War, which remained in activity until 1966, when it was a casualty of integration. When the public schools were finally integrated in Montgomery County, most of CI was sold off and most of the buildings were bulldozed. They're now attempting to both settle its history, literally in a place, collect its archive and preserve its history, but also preserve the buildings. There are still 4 of the buildings standing there near the new aquatic center, across the road from the aquatic center there in Christiansburg. And we're hoping very much in the next couple of years that it will become a very active center for public activism and history, I guess, in the New River Valley. But anyway, that got me started in this. And one of the things that stunned me when I started poking around in historical corners was how radically different Montgomery County today is from the county of 100 or 150 years ago. Quite literally, I mean, just looking at the county today is a radically different experience. The last estimates for the population of Montgomery County that I can find, which is 2009, fewer than 5% of the residents of Montgomery County were African American, about 4.5%. In the mid-19th century, the population was about 24% black. One face in, if I was in this room in 1860 or 1870 or 1880, one face in 4 would be black. It was a radically different community than we live in today. And that's what got my interest, is where did they all go? What happened? And so what I've begun working on is a history of the African American community from the last decades of slavery, because I need to have a base to work from, through the early 20th century. The population peaked, the African American population peaked in 1880 when it was about 4,500, and then went down steadily until really the 1960s before it's now rising. We are now almost back to the level the African American population was in 1880. In terms of numbers, not in terms of percentage, in terms of numbers. So it's slowly working its way back up. So this is part of a longer project. And that's why the description is a bit vague. When I approached Terry about doing this talk, I had really just begun the research. And I really didn't know how much I was going to find or how much I'd have to say when I got here. And so I left myself room to wander by basically just saying it would cover anything between 1840 and 1880. What I really want to talk about tonight is going to be the antebellum years. I don't expect I'll have time, we'll see, I don't expect to have time to get even to the Civil War, much less to Reconstruction. Terry will have to invite me back some other time, I guess. But I want to focus really on about the last 10 or 15 years of the antebellum period. And while it's titled both Slavery and Freedom, and I do want to talk a little bit about slavery, mainly that is simply to, again, establish what this county was like in ways that many, many, many people have forgotten. Even the most recent history of Montgomery County describes the African American population as a small percentage. In spite of the fact they have the numbers in the book, but apparently the author decided that 24% was a small percentage. This community was very much a part of the slave South. Now, unfortunately, I was doing this on my computer when these looked a lot bigger. I'll have to make them bigger next time. Those of you who aren't familiar, these are the works of a man named Lewis Miller. Miller was born in he was German American by birth, a Pennsylvanian, but he spent a good number of years before and after the Civil War in Christiansburg. He's actually buried in Christiansburg, and did dozens of paintings of Blacksburg, of Christiansburg, and of the surrounding county in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, including dozens of pictures of African Americans. The ones on the top left are clearly slaves. That is a slave sale going on in Christiansburg, probably in the 1850s. The ones down below, I honestly don't know if they're slave or not. They are African Americans laboring. Chances are they are slaves, but there's no guarantee. But African Americans were ubiquitous in this county in 1850. 23%, 24% of the population was black. All you have to do is flip through the county records. Slaves were everywhere. They were bought and sold. They were rented. They were in people's houses. They were on the streets. That was how, if you wanted a mortgage, that was probably what you would put up for collateral, were slaves. The records are full of evidence that this was the slave South. You know, this is not Alabama, or not the Black Belt, not miles and miles of cotton fields, but this was still a community in which, as I said, over 20% of the population were slaves. Almost 20% of the families in this county owned slaves. 18% of the households, 18.5% of the households had slaves in Montgomery County. In Christiansburg, almost half, 41% of the families living in Christiansburg in 1860 had slaves. Blacksburg was a little less. Christiansburg was the rich big city. Blacksburg was the little backwater in the 1860s. So we didn't have as much money, not as many slaves, but still about 14% of the families here in the town of Blacksburg owned slaves. And this was not domestic slavery. Some of it was, yes. Some of this was a servant around the house. But most of these people were actually field slaves or serious slave labor on large plantations. 2/3 of the slaves in this county, so well over half, 2/3 of the slaves lived in holdings of 10 slaves or more. The largest was 123. James Kent's plantation. The Radfords had about 80. No one Preston owned that many slaves anymore, but if you divvy up the Preston family out on the outskirts of campus, there's another 100 slaves out there. These were large slave holdings. About 20 of them qualified by the definition as plantations. The traditional historical definition of a plantation is 20 slaves or more. And there were about 20 plantations here in Montgomery County. Can we dim the lights at all a little bit just for a minute? I just wanted to give people a visual image, a visual sense of how pervasive slavery was in this county on the eve of the Civil War. These are not all of the slaves in the county. At some point, it becomes counterproductive to try to put that many dots on one map. These are simply the average or above average slave holdings. There were over 200 slave holdings in this county, about 270. This is the top 120, 130 or so. That's Kentland, way out there on the top left, the Kent family, and then the Radford family. The circles are roughly proportional to the size. But as you can see, I didn't bring my pointer. Christiansburg is right in the center. North of it is Blacksburg. There's a significant number of slaves if you go down around Reiner, down into what was then called Five Points, down towards the Childress neighborhood. They're slaves. On the right-hand side is the straightaway between Shawsville, where I live, and Elliston. And it's just one series of plantations after another. Fotheringay is the one people hear about because it's still standing. But there were half a dozen large plantations along that road, all of them worked by significant numbers of slaves. So this is the slave South. There is no, you can't ignore that. And it was not a dying institution in Montgomery County. The number of slaves in this county increased by 50% between 1850 and 1860. It was growing rapidly, fiercely, because of the railroad. The railroad arrived here in the early 1850s, and it suddenly became feasible to raise tobacco. You could always raise tobacco in Montgomery County, but you couldn't get it to market and be competitive. The railroad changed that. And so tobacco cultivation in this county went up 15-fold in 10 years. 1,500% increase in 10 years. And most of that was slave labor. That's why slavery was booming in this county on the eve of the Civil War. This is not a dying institution. We're not out on the fringe of the South where slavery was unimportant. It was an absolutely essential part of the community. Now, I just want to establish that because it is so widely ignored or forgotten, I guess, in this county. But what I want to focus on actually is not the slaves, at least not tonight. I haven't got enough time tonight. What I want to focus on tonight is actually the free black community. The people in this community who were legally free but were African American. People forget about them. They're sort of the neither fish nor fowl in Southern history. They're not slaves, but they're not white folk either. And they occupied an odd middle ground that we're only now beginning to understand properly. Now, free blacks date back in Virginia to at least 1624. They may be earlier than that. That's the first record we have because that's the first surviving census for Virginia. It was done in 1624, and it included several free African Americans. And they were here continuously after 1624. It was legal in Virginia, beginning in 1782, so just after the Revolution. It was legal for a slave owner to emancipate his or her slaves. It's also called manumission or emancipation. You could free your slaves. Technically, freed slaves were required to leave the state, beginning in 1806. It was not automatic, and in fact the law was widely ignored, as I'll talk about. But at least on paper, freed slaves were supposed to leave the state. They were regarded as a potential burden and danger to the state of Virginia, and therefore must leave. And increasingly were subject to legal restrictions, especially after the Nat Turner uprising in 1832. Nat Turner, of course, was a slave in Southampton County who led the most successful slave uprising in Virginia history and terrified the white population. And so a great many laws were passed in the wake of Nat Turner that, at least on paper, created a legal limbo in which African Americans were not supposed to have contact with anybody. They weren't supposed to gather. They weren't supposed to associate with slaves. They weren't supposed to associate with white folks. They couldn't carry guns. They couldn't be peddlers. They couldn't be preachers. All kinds of restrictions on paper. What we're finding out is that actually wasn't the case. Nor was it true that in the antebellum years, the Jim Crow attitudes were present. You know, we assume that racial attitudes in the 1840s, 1850s were like they were in the 1940s. That was not the case. As far as we're starting to find out that in spite of what the laws said, African Americans actually functioned in a remarkably interesting way in white majority counties such as Montgomery County. They were not equal. You know, we certainly don't want to go down that road. But they were not subjected to the full rigors of the law in ways that we thought for a very long time. Now, in Montgomery County, there were in 1860, as far as we know, 147 free African Americans, free blacks. Not a lot, 147 out of about 8,000 residents of the county, about 2% of the total population, about 5% of the African American population. So most African Americans in this county were slaves, over 2,000 of them. 147 were free. We don't know when they first arrived here. The earliest that we can say for sure was 1790. The 1790 census showed that there were 6 free blacks living in what was then Montgomery County. The problem is Montgomery County in 1790 was about 5 times as big as it is now. And we don't know we don't know if they were actually in modern Montgomery County. That didn't come into being until 1840. So from 1790 to 1840, we don't quite know where things were in Montgomery County in many cases. But free blacks go back at least as far as 1790. Manumission, white residents of Montgomery County freeing their slaves, dates back at least to 1803. It may be earlier than that. All I know is I haven't found any documents yet before 1803. But as early as 1803, white residents of Montgomery County were occasionally freeing their slaves, many of whom then stayed in the county, regardless of what the law said. I'll get to that in a few minutes. They stayed, and so that became a source for increasing the black population. And just like white Virginians, black Virginians migrated. We know that, again, at least as early as 1806, free blacks were moving into Montgomery County. There's a record down in the courthouse. A young man named Abraham Mars, who was free black from Franklin County, Virginia, had been freed in Franklin County apparently, or born free in Franklin County, we're not sure which, came up to Montgomery County, presented his freedom papers to the court, and was authorized to stay in the county. That's as early as 1806. So we know that both manumission and black migration began almost as early as the county did, early in the 19th century, and continued. And so there's a natural growth of the free black population during much of the antebellum period, both by natural growth, people here having babies. Mars, for example, Hercules Mars, who came, like I said, in 1806, was I don't know exactly all of the network of the family yet. I'm still trying to figure all these out. But the Mars family became one of the largest families black families in Montgomery County by the eve of the Civil War. Unfortunately, the green doesn't show up at all under the light. I tried to map where the free blacks were. The Mars family actually was out near Radford, in what was called Shellville, where the Shell family lived. If the lights were a little dimmer, we'd be able to see that there. I can't locate every one of the free blacks. There are about 70 families, but I think I've located about 65 of them on the map. And they're pretty much in exactly the same places that the slaves were. They're in Christiansburg, in Blacksburg, down in the stretch between Shawsville and Elliston, out in Lafayette, in what was then called Lovely Mount, which is now Radford, down in there's a large community, if you look down near Snowville, this will be sort of the lower left-hand corner of that map, just below Childress Road, a large free black community. But they're pretty much in the same areas where the slaves were throughout the county. Anyway, the family, through natural growth, families like the Mars became very large in the county, continued in migration. And again, the railroad contributed to that. We often think of the Irish as building railroads in the United States, and they did, but so did African Americans. The Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, which built the rail line through Montgomery County in the early 1850s, rented 33 slaves. That was the bulk of their labor force here in the county. These were slaves that their owners were back in places like Bedford and Lynchburg. The railroad rented them, brought them up here, and they did most of the railroad work here in Montgomery County, along with the Irish. There were a number of Irish as well. But some of those black railroad workers then stayed in the area. They were free black workers who came in with the railroad as well as rented slaves. Manumission continued in spite of Nat Turner. White Southerners, white Virginians were terrified by Nat Turner and tried to make it harder to free slaves. But in the years before the Civil War, white residents of Montgomery County continued freeing slaves. In fact, the last manumission that I can find was actually just 2 weeks before John Brown's raid, so right up until 1859. Now, as I said, legally, the manumitted slaves were supposed to leave the county. But there was a procedure to get around that. There's a procedure for everything in this country. If you went to the county court, you had to go to the court and ask for permission to stay. The sheriff would send out a call to all of the justices of the peace. This is something that it was considered such an important action that it couldn't be just a couple of JPs. You had to call all the JPs in, and there had to be a 2/3 majority that would approve the petition. In the meantime, the would-be resident of Montgomery County, this former, the freed slave, had to post a statement on the courthouse door of his or her intention to stay, identifying who I am, that I wish to stay in the county, so that if anybody in the county objected, they could go to the court and register their objection. Only when that process was completed would the county court officially say, okay, you can stay. Then there was a book called the Book of Free Negroes, still down in the courthouse, in which they would enter a physical description of the individual, how he came to be free, born free in the county, manumitted by Mary Wade or whoever, moved in from Franklin County, whatever the details, and would issue them a piece of paper, a pass. And technically, they were to carry this with them at all times, because if they were found without it, the assumption was you're a slave and you've run away from your master, so we're going to arrest you. Every free black was supposed to carry this piece of paper around with them and to go back to the court every 3 years and have it updated, which they never did. Most of the free blacks in Montgomery County, if they show up in the Free Negro book at all, and only about half of them do, if they show up at all, they show up usually just once. There are only a couple who ever came back to re-up their certificates, and that was usually after 10 or 20 years, not 3. The law on the books was one thing. In practice, nobody wanted the bother of that much legal activity. And so generally, African Americans registered one time, if that, and tried not to lose their certificate. But they occasionally lost them. They'd go into court and would explain to the judge what happened, or explain to the justices what happened, and they'd give them a new one. And just give them a new certificate, and off they'd go. In the county, as I said, the geographic distribution of the free black community was in many ways similar to that of slaves, scattered throughout the county. The big difference, not surprisingly, when you think about it, free blacks were a much more urban population than anybody else in Montgomery County. Neither Christiansburg nor Blacksburg was very big, about 400 in Christiansburg in 1860, Blacksburg about half of that, maybe 2/3. So the most white residents of Montgomery County lived out in the country on farms, as did most free blacks. But about a quarter of the free black population lived just in the town of Christiansburg. Why? It's where the jobs were. Free blacks, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, didn't own much land. It was difficult to buy land if you were African American living in Montgomery County, even if you were free, even if you had money. And so African Americans tended, more than whites, to live in either Christiansburg, which was the big city, or Blacksburg, or Lafayette. I mean, how many of you have ever even been to Lafayette? Yeah, a couple. Lafayette, no one knows about Lafayette anymore. It was actually the up-and-coming city until 1850, when the railroad went to Elliston instead. Lafayette got left behind, and Elliston became the booming metropolis it is today. Anyway, the African Americans went where there were jobs. And so the free black population, while still majority rural, there was a very large urban minority of African American men and women. And this is where you see, again, some of these long established families. In Christiansburg, for example, the Campbell family. were the dominant African-American family. And this is still one of the mysteries to me. I do not yet know where the Campbells came from. There were 3 sisters. I know their mother was named Hannah Campbell, and they were all born in Christiansburg born in the county sometime in the early 19th century. But by 1860, there are these 3 women and their children living in Christiansburg, a little neighborhood of Campbells, actually not too far from where the Summit restaurant is now, right along that little street. That was a black neighborhood where the Campbells lived. These, like many free black households, were female-headed. I've found the Campbells on a number of censuses and have never found a male in the household. They were listed as widows in 1865. After the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau did a census. And all 3 of the Campbell sisters are shown as widows, but I've never seen a Mr. Campbell. So I don't know. I'm not sure. They may well have been married to slaves, so I'll talk about in a minute. I don't yet know the exact makeup of this family. But they and the Mars were sort of the dominant black families free black families in Christiansburg, or in Montgomery County. Marriage was, as it was for white folks, common for free blacks. This was the normal state. I cannot say exactly how many were married, because in spite of the law said free blacks could not marry slaves. In fact, free blacks did marry slaves. At least a dozen that I know of couples were a male slave or a female slave and a free black man or woman. It happened a lot. The problem is, none of that was legal. There's no record of slave marriages because they didn't exist under law. After the Civil War, the state of Virginia ordered in every county what was called the cohabitation register. The Freedmen's Bureau was to collect the names of all African-American couples living as husband and wife. And that was done in Montgomery County. 324 couples, all identified. Last seen in 1979. The document seems to have vanished. There is a transcription of 10% of the document, but the rest of it, I don't yet know where it is. I'm looking, but I haven't found it yet. But I know from that document that there were at least a third of the free black adults in the county were married. Some married to other free blacks. There were at least 9 couples where both husband and wife were free. There were at least 9 couples in which one partner was a slave and one was free, sometimes on the same plantation. There are cases where a free black was living on a particular plantation. Nathaniel Harvey, for example, who lived down near Childress. Nathaniel Harvey had a number of slaves. He also had a free black man living in his household who was married to one of his slaves. It's illegal, but Harvey didn't mind. The husband and wife didn't mind. Nobody complained. Everything was fine. And there were at least 2 mixed-race couples in the county. Completely against the law, completely against what most people expect was going on in Virginia. There were at least 2 free black men married to white women. And their children are listed as white in the census in 1860. Unfortunately, they seem to have vanished between 1860 and 1870. I haven't been able to track them down yet, but there were at least, and again, we know from other counties, this was not that unusual. It was illegal. It defies all of our expectations, but it seems not to have been unusual in Virginia in 1850 or 1860 for an interracial couple to quietly live in a corner of Montgomery County. Now, among these free blacks, most of the men were farm laborers of one kind or another. So far, I have not found a single free black landowner, farm owner, excuse me. There were a lot of free black men who worked on farms, but so far I've not found one that owned a farm. They may have rented. We don't have records for most leases, but they didn't own them. There were other men, however, other free black men that were tradesmen. There were at least 4 black carpenters in the county. There were a couple of brakemen working for the railroad. After the Civil War, this became one of the major occupations for black men, was working for the railroad. It started before the Civil War. There were at least 2 brakemen in the county in 1860. There was a mattress maker. There were a couple of blacksmiths. None of them were large businessmen, but there was at least one moderately successful, sort of middle-class black businessman, again, one of the Campbells, William Campbell, who was, according to the census, a grocer. Now, this did not mean he ran a greengrocer. It's not Kroger. Grocer was basically a little general merchant. William Campbell was a grocer in the town of Christiansburg, probably starting in the 1840s. He got a loan from a white neighbor, a $100 loan that he seems to have used in the early 1840s to get his business started. And he continued in business for about 15 years. Unfortunately, I can't find his account books, so I can't say for sure who his customers were, but given the population around him, he probably had both black and white customers. He certainly borrowed, or at least bought from, white general merchants. Campbell imported goods from Lynchburg, from Richmond, from Baltimore, going to white merchants in each of these cities to buy goods, which were then shipped by rail into Christiansburg, where he sold them in his store. Unfortunately, Campbell, like a lot of people, got caught in the Panic of 1857. It was a sudden drop in the American economy in 1857. A great many people went bankrupt, including William Campbell. He was sued by a couple of the merchants from whom he had bought goods. He didn't go to jail, and it wasn't like that. He was a painter, became a painter in the county. But his business as a storekeeper ended about 1857 in a series of lawsuits. Women were by and large washerwomen or domestic workers. Or they have no occupation listed. The census, the women who were listed, the Campbells, for example, all 3 of the Campbell sisters are listed as washerwomen in Christiansburg, probably taking in laundry like the Chinese did in San Francisco. That's what African Americans did in parts of the American South, including Christiansburg, apparently. But it's amazing how much money you can make if you're a clever washerwoman and don't waste your money. As far as I can tell from the census, there were 9 free blacks who owned real estate in Montgomery County. Not farms. These are mainly home lots. But there were 9 free blacks who owned land. 7 of them were women, including the Campbells. Nancy Campbell, for example, bought a lot in Christiansburg, bought building materials in Christiansburg, and had a house built. Unfortunately, she then lost it in the Panic of 1857. She got sued too and lost her house. Another of the Campbells, Caroline Campbell. I don't know the backstory to this. Caroline Campbell is one of the few African Americans that actually, in the court records, shows as buying and holding land. Problem is, she didn't actually get the deed. She bought land from a man named George St. Clair, who was one of the big developers in Christiansburg in the 1850s, but he was very old, and he died before she actually got the deed in her hand. And so 30 years later, in the 1880s, her heirs sued and got the lease, got the deed. So they finally got the land. It took them 30 years. But two of the Campbell women, the only man that I can find actually owning land and paying taxes on his land was, again, a Campbell, John Campbell, who was a carpenter down in Elliston, down in what was then called Big Spring, near the railroad station. Now, none of these people were rich. Many of the free blacks had no property at all, according to the census. About a third did show some personal property, not real estate, personal property, clothing, tools, a horse perhaps, in quantities ranging from $10 to $300, which actually was a lot of money. $300 was a good bit of money. And there were plenty of whites who were just as poor or poorer than these free blacks economically. They were in the bottom part of society, but they were not at the very bottom. There were a lot of white folks in the county who were just as poor as the free blacks. One area in which they were, again, supposed to be cut out entirely was education. It was illegal in Virginia at this time to educate an African American, free or slave. Black schools were illegal. It was illegal for a white person to receive money to teach a black person. Technically, African Americans weren't supposed to go to school at all. There were some public schools in the county for indigent whites. Actually, they weren't schools, they were teachers. The state of Virginia had a literary fund that paid for indigent whites to receive education, and dozens of poor white kids in Montgomery County got educated that way. Not a single free black child did. But somewhere they learned to read. According to the 1860 census, the census taker asked, can you read, can you write, and asked the free blacks. And not quite half, but about 40% of adult free blacks. They did not ask children. You had to be an adult to answer this question. But about 40% could either read or write. 13%, 8 free black adults were fully literate, and another quarter could at least read, which again wasn't that different from the white population. There were large numbers of illiterate whites in Montgomery County at that time, and large numbers that could only read, or maybe scroll their name and couldn't read at all. Somewhere they got this education, and it's one of the great mysteries, because it's totally under the radar. There are no records of it that I've been able to find yet. I keep rummaging. Probably this was all going on at home, elders teaching children. Similarly, churches. It was illegal for a black church to exist in Virginia at this time. Blacks did attend white churches. I don't yet know how many. I do know there were at least 30 black Baptists in the county. Charles Schaefer, who was the freedmen's agent who helped found Christiansburg Institute after the Civil War, was a Baptist. And he wrote about encountering 30 black residents of Montgomery County who'd been Baptists of, as he put, some branch of the Baptist denomination before the Civil War. Others were probably worshiping in Methodist churches or Episcopal churches. I know there were at least some attending church with the Prestons, because they got into a gunfight after the Civil War when the slaves continued trying to attend the church, and the Prestons said, no, 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 you can't come here. But that's for another lecture. So there were, in spite of the law, free blacks were managing to educate themselves, managing to make a living, managing to worship. What's particularly interesting is their actual relationship with whites, with the white government, with the white establishment. As I mentioned, there were some interracial marriages, 2 that I know of. There's at least one man who changed race. He appears some years as a mulatto, some years as a white man. Seems to move back and forth across the line. Blacks and whites clearly did business with one another. Both William Campbell and Nancy Campbell borrowed money from white people. And yes, they were sued, but then so were lots of other white folks. Whites happily sued one another in this country in the 1850s if they needed money. So that's not racism, that was just capitalism. From the government's perspective, things were different. I mean, this is where you really see the second-class status of free blacks. Yes, they were free, but not really. They had to carry their freedom papers, for one thing. No white man had to carry a pass saying, I have a right to be here. Free blacks had to carry a piece of paper with them to demonstrate they were in fact free. They could not vote. No African American was allowed to vote legally, and as far as I can tell, no African American did vote in this county before the Reconstruction era. Schools were closed to them. They were not allowed to attend schools. They clearly got an education, but not through schools. The poorhouse, which was about the extent of social services in Montgomery County, as far as I can tell, no free black was ever admitted to the Montgomery County poorhouse no black person until after the Civil War. They did have at least some form of social security, though, some sort of safety net. Indentures were a common mechanism for dealing with poor children. The overseers of the poor would take a poor child and basically sell his services to a person until he turned 21 to be educated and learn a craft. Free blacks were indentured just like poor white folks. And in at least one case, this was specifically seen as public aid. Harriet Campbell, another of the Campbell clan, was indentured, and the document describes her as, quote, a free Negro of the said county who has to be provided for and assisted by the overseers of the said county. She was regarded as a member of the community who should be cared for by the community. That's very rare. Generally, as far as I can tell, generally free blacks were not accorded that kind of treatment by the state, but in this case, at least one she did. But again, this was a common phenomenon. It was more common for African Americans. And this, I don't think, is just a matter of poverty. African American children seem to have been put into indenture more frequently as a percentage of the population than they should have been. Relative, they're only about 2% of the population, but they're considerably more than that of the children who were put out to indenture. I think that may be because there was no, the poorhouse wasn't an option for blacks, so it was out to indenture. And there were a number. Some of them orphans, but many of them, their parents were alive. Hercules Mars, one of the Mars clan, put his son out for indenture. So this was a fairly common practice, again, for whites and blacks. As servants, as indentured servants, as far as I can tell, African Americans were treated very similar to poor whites. They were to serve until age 21. Men were generally to learn either farming or a craft like blacksmith or carpenter. Women were invariably to learn the art and mystery of housewifery, as it was described. And at age 21, those who were training in crafts like a carpenter, at age 21, black or white, generally got $25 when they came of age and a suit of clothing. Those who were agricultural servants or women generally just got clothing and were turned loose at 21. And the courts would enforce these. John Campbell, again, one of the Campbell clan, a young man who was put out to indenture, Campbell sent his attorney to the county court to say, I'm being held beyond the limits of my indenture by Adam Wall, and I want to sue him. Adam Wall was ordered to come into court, explain why he was holding John Campbell, and the court said, you were in violation, and voided the indenture. Off went Campbell. So free blacks as servants seem to have had basically the same rights. Oh, with one exception. White children were also to receive education. They were to learn to read, write, and do common arithmetic to the rule of 3, which meant proportions. African Americans, at least they could not write that into the indenture because it would be a blatant violation of the law. It is always possible, I can't prove it yet, but it's always possible that some black servants were educated by their masters, but I can't prove it yet. That's the only difference that I can see between white servitude and black servitude at that level, the indentures. Otherwise, again, at the legal level, as citizens of the county, there were clearly distinctions. African Americans could not serve on juries. African Americans could not testify against a white man. So if you were cheated by a white man, legally you could not testify against him. Now, this does not mean that blacks had no legal rights. Because if you actually look at the court cases, the courts seem to have been quite scrupulous about preserving the legal rights of African Americans, both free and slave. In one fascinating case, a slave was accused of attacking his master. The court went to the bother of not only calling a dozen witnesses, they sent a sheriff down to Lynchburg, spending money to bring back a witness, and ended up acquitting this slave. Black violence against blacks was often ended in acquittal, not always. And even a case in 1864 where a white man, Vincent Ferguson, was killed by a free black, I'm sorry, other way around. Vincent Ferguson killed a free black, was tried, sentenced, and sent off to the state penitentiary. So they certainly were not equal, but this is not, again, this is not the South of 1950, where African Americans were totally railroaded by the system. They were accepted as citizens. The strangest example of that, and I'll end with this one because it's a total mystery to me still, is again one of the Mars clan, young James Mars. Mars was a free black, so he's supposed to have his papers with him. Well, in the spring of 1861, just as the Civil War was breaking out, James Mars was arrested for allegedly showing his paper to a slave. Presumably the fear was that the slave was going to copy this and have a forged free pass and escape with it. So Mars is hauled into court. A couple of weeks later, the attack on Fort Sumter has occurred. Virginia has seceded. James Mars, black man, sends word to the court, I would like to be released so that I may fight for the state of Virginia. The court says, okay. And to boot, give him a good clean copy of his free papers, because the old one got kind of beat up. James Mars walked out of jail, and I have no idea where he went. That's, you know, I would love to find out where James Mars went. I suspect he was a really clever young man who got out of jail and never came back to the county, but I can't prove it. So, as I said, I'm just starting this research. I have a lot more that I want to do, and if Terry invites me back, I'll tell you more about it later on. So.